This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Novak's webinar series. This is the second in the series for 2020. We started this last year and had pretty good success. We tend to try to have one of these every month, sometimes more, sometimes less. We try to provide information on topics that we think will be relevant to the OHV community. And we have an outstanding presenter tonight. We'll get to him in just a second. Want to make it clear that we have several Novak staff on the call who will be monitoring the chat. And we also have our chairman of board of directors, Dan Kleen from Iowa, as well as another director, Barrett Brown from Oregon. So welcome to them. And of course, welcome to everybody who's taken the time out of their busy night to talk about and learn about how to work with land managers and build positive relationships. I'm really excited to introduce Tom Crimmins, who'll be giving the presentation tonight. He's been a friend and a colleague for a long time. I've only been with Novak for a little less than 3 years, but I've been working with Novak since about 2005. And I think all of that time I've known Tom Crimmins. He's always been one of my personal favorite people. And I think his knowledge and demeanor and skill in the area of working with land managers is unmatched. He has a several decade history of working with the Forest Service. He knows exactly the type of relationships that can move OHV access and OHV opportunities forward because he's been in that seat. And we know what he can accomplish. And I think he has a lot of advice. I think you'll find the way he presents enjoyable. And I personally am excited about stopping talking myself and turning it over to Tom. Before I do that, one last quick reminder, if you're on your phone, please hit mute on your phone. With that, Tom, ready to get started?
Well, thank you, Dwayne. Appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'd like to thank the other staff that were responsible for setting this thing up, and for those attending, I'd like to thank you as well for being here. Working with land managers, I was on the receiving end of a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about, but we will get started. As Dwayne said, I've been around a long time and worked with Novak quite a bit. And had a good time and still working with Novak. So to build a solid relationship, you need some basic information, and also you need to build a solid foundation. So let's start with the basic information. If you're involved with a particular piece of ground that you're riding on, or that you want to ride on, or you're involved with, one of the first things that you need to know is what agency controls the land that you're interested in. If you're out riding, it really doesn't make any difference whether it's BLM ground, park ground, or Forest Service ground. But for some reason or other, the agency folks really care about that. So you need to find out what agency controls the land. The next thing you need to find out, basic information, is that where's the closest office for that land management agency? Now, in some places with all of these agencies, they have a hierarchical office system, and the one that you may be in a town where this has the supervisor's office, but the actual piece of ground is managed by a ranger district. So you need to find that out as well. The next thing you need to know is what is the name of the line officer that's at that particular agency office. And the line officers are basically the decision makers within the agencies. They may be at various levels. In a Forest Service, which is my background, you had the regional foresters and the forest supervisors and the district rangers. And those are your line officers. Those are the people that sign the decisions that get made. They're the people that make the decisions. The staff officers, on the other hand, are the folks that provide the support to the line officers and actually do most of the work. Now, you can find this information on the web. For Forest Service, it's fs.fed.us. For BLM, it's blm.gov. And you can also find it for if it's your local park system or something else. They all have websites and they have directories. But you need to get the name of the individual that's handling trails in the particular office. And that individual may not be listed in your directories. And they may have a whole lot of different titles. They may be a rec officer, a resource officer, or some other particular title. In that case, you may just call the office and ask them, what's the name of the fellow that's managing trails? So once you get that kind of information, you can start building a foundation. Laura, next slide. Thank you. So kind of to start with, we want to talk about who you're going to get involved. If you're working with a club, who you're going to send as a representative. If you're the individual that's going to be doing it, you need to go through this same issue with you. But what is it that makes managers easier to work with? And we've all had managers that are easy and probably not fun to work with, but they're easy anyhow, or easier. But they've all got some particular traits. They have knowledge. They understand the various uses that are occurring on their district or what have you. They understand the kinds of recreation that's occurring, if that's what we're involved with. They're fair. When they make a decision, there's not a lot of bias involved in it. They don't always go one way. They're fair. They understand that decisions are a weighing issue, and we'll talk about that later, but they're fair in their decision making, and they're trustworthy. When they say they're going to try to do something, they'll try to do it. Now, it may change because there may be some edict come down from above, or there may be a change in their priorities that they didn't particularly plan on, but they're generally trustworthy, and they're honest. And when they say they're going to try to do something, they do it. They have the desire to get the right job done. Now, the right job may not necessarily be opening all the trails we'd like to have, but they're interested in getting the right job done. And they understand our needs, the OHV users' needs. And they're willing to take the time to gain that understanding. So when we're looking at the person we're going to be sending forward, if it's a representative from a club, the question comes to mind is which of these things do not apply to the members of the public? And of course, the answer is they all apply. Our people have to be knowledgeable. They have to be fair, willing to compromise if necessary, trustworthy, honest. They need to get the right job done. As I mentioned, that may not be opening all the trails. And they need to understand the agency needs. Now here, it probably should be mentioned that one of the fastest ways to destroy a positive relationship is to fail to follow the rules of responsible riding. You may not believe that a particular trail should be closed, but if it is, don't use it, because it eliminates building trust, and it eliminates a lot of other things that we need to have working with us. Next slide. So to start with, and I'm focusing here on a club member or whatever, but you need to identify a member, an individual that's going to take the lead as the contact person. It's hard for an agency to deal with a whole bunch of folks, but so if they're able to build that working relationship with one or two people, then that makes it a lot easier. Now, these folks need to be able to commit the time that's needed, and it is going to take time. There's going to be a lot of meetings. There's going to be some requests for input. There's going to be requests for information. And so it's going to take some time. So somebody has to have that time. That time is normally going to occur during the work days. So if you've got somebody that's working the same shifts as the agency folks, then that makes it a little difficult to connect, but it can still be done. You've got to be somebody that's able to work with people. People we agree with, people we disagree with. You need to understand the agency and its policies. And this is one of the things that's going to take the most time. It's easier if you can find an ex-bureaucrat that's current on the rules and regulations that as a member of your club or whatever, that's able to do that, and so they get a little heads up. But otherwise, it's going to take some time sitting down and looking at the rules and regulations that the agency has to deal with. And this part takes a lot of time and continued work, because rules and policies change from time to time, and it takes work to keep up. And I'm a great example of this. I've been out of the agency now for about 23 years. When I left, we had an appeal process that I understood pretty well. That has changed, and I didn't take the time, and I'm not interested in taking the time to go through and figure out what all the new changes are that are coming up. But whoever's going to be acting as a representative is going to have to be able to at least get that development, that knowledge. A new change that's coming up. The Trump administration has asked the Corps of Engineers to withdraw the Waters of the U.S. rule. Hasn't been withdrawn yet, but it should be shortly. This could very easily have some effect on trail management controls, trail management restrictions, but it's something to look at. So once you've identified that information, the next step is they need to start getting involved with making the rest of it work. And this, again, I need to mention that this representative is not the attack dog in the group, and all of our groups have them. We know who they are, but this isn't that guy. You don't want to start with an adversarial relationship. The attack dog may be useful in the future, however. Next slide. You need to start off by making an appointment. Plan on 15 to 30 minutes. These folks are busy. They've got a lot of things pressing on them for their time. With the reductions in force and the reductions in funding, they're ending up with more jobs, different jobs, and all that kind of stuff. So take the time, make an appointment, and figure 15 to 30 minutes. When you're getting ready for the appointment, arrive early, because it could be that whatever they were doing before got done early, or the meeting they were in got done early, and they may have a little bit of extra time. So get there early and be there, ready to go. When you start off, introduce yourself and your organization if you're representing a club. Let them know what you're interested in. What kinds of riding do you have? Do you have folks on trials riders? Do you have most of your club side by side, and you're interested in wider areas, wider trails? Some of them may be wider than the 50-inch rule, but let them know what kind of things you're interested in. And that's to be included on their mailing list. And now most of that's all becoming electronic now, but ask them how you get the information on their various projects they're working on. If you've got a bunch of folks that are interested in volunteering or helping out, offer some assistance. Take some time, or take something with you, like a research paper or that kind of type of thing. And ask them about their concerns about OHV recreation. And in this case, you need to listen. Listen to what they say, because if they identify a problem, you need to understand exactly what the problem is and what management sideboards they have to work with. And then maybe you can start working on a possible solution. Ask questions, not to trap them, but to find out exactly what they're saying. And this same works for other communications as well, because folks can answer your question and still not give you the information that you really want. And they're not lying to you, they're just answering your questions. A great case in point that I came across in my consulting with Novak is I happened to be sitting in a motel one time, and there was a room with a bunch of video games around, and there was an older fella and a younger kid. And the older fella was there and doing his thing, and the younger thing, I'm assuming was a brother, came up and says, "Do you have any quarters?" And the older guy says, "No, I don't have any quarters." And the young kid looked around a little bit, thought a little bit more, and he came back. He says, "You think there's some quarters in the room?" And the older fellow said, "Yeah, I don't know. There may be quarters in the room. I don't know." Well, the little one waited a little more time, and he says, "Do you can we go to the room and get the quarters?" And the older brother said, "No, I don't have the key." Little one asked, "Who has the key?" The guy said, "Well, Dad probably has the key." Little guy says, "Where's Dad?" Or, "Dad, will you come and help me find Dad so we can go to the room?" So they wandered off and went around there. Well, if you see, we all know exactly the question that the little guy was asking with question 1. Where can I get some quarters to play these video games? That was his question. But the older brother answered every question that he asked truthfully, but he didn't get the information that he really wanted. So you've got to do the same kind of thing. If you ask, or if he tells you something about an issue that he's got to be involved with, ask him or her to explain what's real problem. What's the big part of the issue, and then get it involved and become more involved in gathering more details. At this first meeting, try not to focus on a specific issue. There's going to be plenty of time of that later, but what you're starting to do is just build a relationship with the thing that you're there, you're interested, and you want to be involved. And there's some other things you can do to build relationships. Next slide. You can start by taking folks out for a ride. Next slide. Okay. Next one. One more time, Laura. When you're taking them out for a ride, 4-wheel drive or side-by-sides are easier, but ATVs and motorcycles will work. It's okay if they're trained. In this case, as you get started, you got to think about what you're dealing with and who you're dealing with. This is not necessarily the time to show the manager how great of a rider you are or how tough the trails are. Managers remember people that hurt them. While speed may add to the excitement of the experience for a new experienced rider, it can be threatening to a new rider. You can also show them that slow speeds can be very enjoyable as well. Plan a trip that leaves a lot of time at frequent stops to talk about the issues in general and to talk about specific issues. If you have an issue with signing, plan a stop at an intersection that may be a problem. And if they suggest some damaged area that is a concern to them, take some time to go down and go and see it. If you can include it in your ride, go down and take a look at it and get some more information on what kind of issues they're dealing with. And you may have an idea on how things can be improved. And try to get them to a nice place where they may not be able to reach with their regular vehicles. And include this in the stop. Use these stops to talk about why these places are important to you, whether it's a high mountain cabin that's an old miner's shack or something that's interesting historically, or whether it's a great view or a mountain lake, whatever it happens to be. But someplace that they're not going to normally get there with their normal vehicles. And the whole thing is getting them to out there on the vehicle and to use the time to talk about some issues. I had a trip with we took in this case, a snowmobile raider, but we took the district ranger out to ride the snowmobile. And we'd set up the trip, made the appointment, everything was scheduled. And when we showed up in the morning, she says, hey, I've got an appointment at 1 o'clock or this afternoon, and I've got to be back to the office at 1 o'clock. Well, we'd planned a whole day, but we figured, okay, well, we'll make that work. And so we went out and we spent some time. We talked about signing on one issue, which was one of our issues that we were dealing with at the time, and took her to some places where she could get out and do some open riding and that kind of stuff with a snowmobile. And we got to a spot that was kind of a backcountry cafe restaurant that you could only get there with a snowmobile in the winter. And we stopped and we had lunch, and she was talking with a bunch of the folks, had some pretty good discussions, and got to be time to leave. And so we said, hey, we got to get you back. The rest of the folks may go ride, but we'll get you back to the trailhead so we can get you back for your meeting. And she says, well, do you have something more that you want to show me? And we said, well, yeah, we got, several more stops. She said, well, let me see what I can do. And so she walked outside with her phone, and I don't know if we even had cell service there, but she tried to talk to somebody. And she came back in and she says, I think I may be able to move that appointment to tomorrow. So she says, why don't we go look at the rest of your stuff? And we did. We spent the rest of the day riding. She got back. She had a great trip. She understood what the issues were when we talked about not being able to have trails, have signs that showed the quickest way back to the trailhead and a few other things that we were dealing with. But she took the time. Next slide. There's always going to be issues. Once you start building these relationships, there's always going to be issues that you can do, that you're going to have between things. It may not be anything you're particularly involved with, but it may be something that the ranger could use some little additional input. He's getting information from the specialists and from the other staff officers that may not ring true, may get conflicting information, just may want to check out some things. But try to be a solution and not a problem. These folks have about all the problems they need. And understand the issues, both sides of the issues, both ours as an OHV rider, but also recognize that there are folks out there that use the woods that don't like to listen to OHVs. They don't like to be challenged on a trail, perhaps. So there's all kinds of other issues. And there's some that we think are completely unreasonable, is that they just don't believe wheels ought to be on the earth. But that's maybe not be one you're going to be able to solve. But you've got to understand both sides. And understand the rules. Crossing through a stream may not seem like a big issue or a big problem, but the sediment that's stirred up with each crossing may damage a trout stream, or there may be some sensitive species that may make things difficult. The agency may not have the legal authority to increase that sediment loading, or maybe they don't have the legal authority to allow impacts on a cultural site that you don't even know is a cultural site. But they may be able to build a bridge or to do a short trail reroute. And all of these kinds of things are solutions that may be reasonable to look at as we go along. And we also may be able to build support from some of the groups that theoretically oppose us. We had a case where we were out working on a trail, and there was a cabin. It was an old Forest Service cabin that we'd ride right. The trail went right by it. You actually came up and dropped off onto a road, went by the cabin, and then back up onto another connection trail. But the equestrians kept discussing and trying to get the manager to close that area, to close that trail, because the equestrians was using the cabin because it had a fenced corral, had a lot of other things, and they were camping there. They'd camp at the cabin and around the cabin. and pasture their horses in the corrals and that kind of thing. Well, we sat down and got to talking with them, and their concern was the conflict with their horses and the fact that the only water that they had was there at the cabin, and they needed to use that water to water their horses and the rest of that stuff. Well, we didn't need to drop down to a road if we had a connection trail. So we suggested that we might want to look at building a reroute or a new connector trail, and we did. They were supportive of the connector trail, kept the OHVs up on the ridge. They had their campsite, their horses didn't get disturbed, and they actually helped us build the trail. So we were able to build a relationship with another user, which initially could have been a strictly conflict situation. Next one, Laura. Try to find win-win situations. Building a small bridge may keep a trail open and keep sediment out of the creek at the same time. Tell the manager what you want, but give them options. Case in point we ran into was when I first moved up to Idaho, my reputation must have preceded me because I got a call from the snowmobiler, and he said, Forest Service is going to close one of our connector trails, and we got to stop them. Can you help us do it? And I said, well, yeah, let's go take a look at it. And so we went out. We drove out in the summer because I didn't have a snowmobile at the time, but we drove out in the summer. And we came along to a junction in the road, and he says, this is it right here. From this point on down, we go down this way and we connect, and it connects down to an intersection that allows us to get across to another district and connect some loops and et cetera, et cetera. So I said, okay, well, let's go take a look at it. We started driving down the road. We were about halfway through, and I turned and said, Al, you're going to lose this road. He says, well, you can't. You don't understand. It's connection to the other districts and all the rest of this stuff. And I says, yeah, Al, I understand. That's the issue, but you're going to lose it. The road basically ran down through a very narrow valley, and the valley was about a quarter of a mile across or a little bit less, filled with tall grass and willows, and the road crossed the creek about 7 times as it was going down there. Road should never have been there in the first place. So we sat down and decided that what the snowmobilers would do is they would propose that we understand why that road needs to be closed, but it's also a critically important road to allow us to connect to other riding areas. And we have a route that we could probably upgrade to make it a groomable trail, but it was too narrow in places, the cut slopes were too high and that kind of stuff, and it needed a lot of work. But we asked her to keep that, if we could keep that one road open until the other road was rebuilt, why then, that would basically solve both problems. And we went ahead and made that proposal, and that's what she accepted. In the decision, it said that this road was going to be closed. However, implementation would be delayed until this other road was rebuilt. Well, at the time, she didn't have timber sales that were in the area, and she said we thought it'd take a couple of years, 2-3 years to get that done. But lo and behold, she figured out some watershed money and some other money that she was able to put together. They rebuilt the road, made a groomable trail out of it, and closed the road that they had. She won, we won, or at least broke even, and had the connections. Another thing, be persistent, but professional. There's a fella in Carolinas, can't remember now which one, and there was a piece of ground. Most of the forest land back there for the Forest Service was started out as private land originally, and then it was being acquired by the government over time. And they had a riding area that they'd been riding in for years. And so the first contact they had with somebody from the Forest Service was an enforcement officer that came out and said, "Hey, guys, we see you're riding in this area, and we just want to let you know this is now Forest Service land. And so these trails are all going to be closed." And so this fella said, well, that wasn't really on his agenda. So what he did is he made an appointment. He went in and talked to the ranger. And the ranger said, yeah, we're going to have to, we did just acquire that land, and we're going to have to close those trails. And he said, well, what can I do? I'd like to help you. I'd like to be able to do something. You're just an individual. He says, we work a lot better with clubs. So Johnny left, and he said, it took me a week. That weekend, a bunch of our guys got together, and we formed the Smoky Mountain ORV Club. And he says, the next week I went in and talked to the ranger, and he said, hi, I'm Johnny. I'm the president of the Smoky Mountain ORV Club, and we ride this area out here particularly, and we really want to get involved with you. And I got some folks that are willing to help out. And the ranger goes, oh, wow, that's great. We love to work with clubs. But, we don't even have a map of the area. So what we're going to end up doing is we'll end up closing that, and then we'll be able to work with you and come back and we'll reopen the trails. So Johnny says, well, he left, and that week they went out and they rode the area and they mapped it all. And he says, next week he was back in there and said to the ranger, he said, well, remember me, I'm president of the Smoky Mountain ORV Club, and we understand you don't have a map of the trails out there. And so we went out and we gave you a map of all these trails that we ride. And the ranger looks at that and he says, boy, you guys can really be a help when we get started on this whole thing. He says, but we got a lot of rules and regulations and stuff that we've got to deal with to get this done. And so Johnny says, gee, is it possible to get a copy of those rules and regulations? And so the ranger says, sure. And Johnny told me, he says, he will bring me out a pile of paper about 3 inches thick. And he says, so I left, took the rules. He says, that took me a little more than 2 weeks. But he says, I went through them, and he says, I didn't find anything that made him close the area. So he says, I went back in and showed him what I thought I'd found, and asked him if I missed anything, and told him, that he was there. They had the club. They were meeting regularly. They were ready to go out and work on the trails, and if there was something needed to get done, they'd be willing to do it. And the ranger looked him straight in the eyes and said, you're serious about this, aren't you, boy? And Johnny says, yes, sir, I am. And he said, well, we want to work with you and make this happen. And right now, that's one of the better riding areas in the entire state. And it all because of one guy who took the time. He was persistent. He didn't go away the first time he said, oh, yeah, this is the problem. But he went through the process. He learned the rules. And they now have a great riding area. But even with a good relationship, every decision is not going to go your way. Next slide. Next slide, Laura. You are going to have disagreements that need to get dealt with. And keep in mind that decisions are professional and not personal on the standpoint of the land managers, but you can make them personal by actions and by threats and all kinds of other things, but they're normally not. Every decision is a balanced decision. There's reason to close a trail. There's reason to keep a trail open. It's a balance. Which one outweighs the other? And they've got to make those decisions. If a decision doesn't go your way, look forward to making the next decision better. Just because a manager doesn't agree with you, that doesn't make them the enemy. There may be some specific rule or regulation or something like that that forces them into that position. Doesn't necessarily make them the enemy. The next decision may go your way. But don't be afraid to move up the chain of command if that's necessary. Once you build that relationship, you're able to go to the ranger or whoever and say, look, I understand what you did. I understand why you did it, but I still think it's the wrong decision, and I want to challenge it, or I want to, in my time, file an appeal or whatever. But that's not a personal attack. That's a professional action that's part of your ability. And if you work through these and move up the command if necessary, not always, but move up the command if it's necessary, you're going to end up with better decisions. Next slide. Less frustration and a lot more opportunities. So at that point, I guess it's open to questions. Dwayne, you want to field?
Okay, thank you, Tom. Excuse me. I really appreciate that, and I hope the knowledge and experience that Tom has came through there, because I really enjoy listening to him, and I think his stories are great. But the truth is, he's been on both sides of this situation. He's been the OHV person coming in, hoping that he could get a decision to go his way, and having to create that relationship with the land manager, having to understand the rules, having to acknowledge that they were there to help and could find ways to bring volunteers, and also, understand that there may be more than one way to have a positive decision. He's also been the person sitting on the other side of the desk that had an OHV community asking for one trail to be open, while another community, non-motorized, was coming in asking to close even more OHV trails. So we all know that that balance has to be struck. Tom's expertise is in the areas of being able to understand with absolute certainty both sides of the coin. And I think some of the stories he told really highlighted that. And that's sort of why we really wanted to have Tom on, to make sure that you had an opportunity to hear from him. And I think it's interesting that we have an opportunity to take from his demeanor. Tom is very knowledgeable. He's very persistent, and he typically gets what he wants, but you never see him lose his temper, or never get angry, or not understand that the person he's dealing with has to make other factors a part of their decision. And some of the most compelling things he talked about were perhaps the snowmobile route, road where it definitely needed to be closed. He recognized that right away. But again, back to the Corda story, it isn't, does this road need to be closed? It's, can we still continue to access the areas we want? And because he thought outside of the box and was willing to work with his manager, they were able to find a way to provide for that opportunity that was different than just keeping that road open. So I think those are some very important things to call out. With that, I think now is a great opportunity. If there are any questions of Tom, specific or general, or particularly about understanding how to develop a good relationship with a land manager, now is the time to start typing away in the chat feature and ask your question. If we get a few minutes here and people aren't comfortable typing, we may have an opportunity for some spoken questions or two. But we sometimes end up with a log jam of people, or some bad quality reception if we do that. So first and foremost, if you have a question in the chat feature, I hope you type it right now. While you guys are thinking about and/or typing questions, I want to make you aware that the NOVAC webinar series is going to continue. We have next month planned a special one. We're going to do a joint webinar with American Trails, and it's going to be about a new initiative called Trails Move People. You will see an announcement for that webinar coming up in the next few days, most likely. But it's an interesting one and exciting. And if it's something that you think would be interesting to you, take a look at the notice and please sign up. With that, we have a question from Tim Dunkel, which is, Tom, do you see differences between public and private land managers?
Yeah, Dwayne, I do. Private land managers generally have a lot more flexibility. Their regulatory agencies are a lot farther away usually, and they're not as actively involved. So a lot of times a private land manager has a lot of ability to do things that a public land manager doesn't. There's a lot of planning requirements, National Environmental Policy Act requirements that or on public land that make simple decisions extremely complicated, but and a private landowner does not necessarily have that. But at the same time, if a private landowner has a cultural site or a resource that's important to protect, why they have the ability to do that as well. So there's a lot more flexibility on the private land manager side.
But to follow up on that, Tom, it doesn't mean that the private managers have no sideboards, right? I mean, you mentioned cultural
No.
side, but sometimes they might have sideboards that are unique to private lands, liability concerns, concerns with neighbors. Maybe they can't go to a certain area because it's too loud over there.
Oh yeah.
You see that?
Yeah, they do. It's a different set of situations, different set of circumstances. And they've got to make some of the same decisions that they go through. Liability is a big issue, particularly if you're talking fee sites where they charge an admission or that kind of thing. But again, it can be managed, and there may be ways for clubs and organizations and groups to get involved with the private owner to help them get through some of these issues, or suggest some alternatives if they've got a neighbor, for example, and that is a good example. We were at one location where there was a trail that there were a bunch of houses down below, and there was one place where the trail turned and went right straight up the hill, straight away from the houses. So all the exhaust sound that came out was coming straight back into the houses. And that's something the housing people didn't want them on that land. But there's some opportunities to relocate a trail, do some things to buffer the sound transmission, and those kinds of things, and to recognize that vegetation may block the view, but it doesn't necessarily block the lower frequency sounds and that kind of stuff. So it's just a matter of understanding what the issues are and trying to figure out ways to get the job done.
Thank you, Tom. Outstanding as ever. We have another question, which is reflect on working out differences between leasing ranchers on public land who want to restrict access.
I'm assuming when you say leasing ranchers, you're talking about permittees or something like that.
Yeah,
Range
permittees grazers or something like that.
Yeah. Again, permittees are paying for that responsibility. They have a strong lobby group if you're talking about grazing permittees or that kind of thing. So there are additional pressures that can be placed on a land manager that's dealing with that, but they don't have ownership in it. Now, if we're talking miners and mining claims, that's a different one. Let's set that one aside for a minute. But grazing permittee, there's cattle move around. They're in different spots, different locations, different areas. And so there may be some ways to reroute trails, change the location. You may go into some seasonal restrictions. The stuff I was dealt with is the cattle were high during the summer, and then they drifted down lower in the winter as it started to get cold. And so there were ways that we were able to have some trails down below during the summer, which of course didn't get the riders up into the nice cool areas that they like to be in and up into the meadows. But we were able to get some trails that were able to get around there and up into some of the ground that the cattle didn't necessarily concentrate on. And so it can be a little more difficult, but it's just another challenge to work through. But you need to recognize that they have the grazing community has a fairly good lobbying group. They've been working with the agencies for years. There are reasons for the agencies to support grazing because it's one of the management tools that they can use to reduce fire and a whole lot of other things. If you're talking about mining claims, that is a whole different ball of wax. Mining claims are not private land until they're patented, but there are a lot of issues with liability, with mine shafts and those kinds of things. And there's also a high value in a lot of the mining areas where they have high value equipment. So maybe it's, there's a trail that goes specifically goes to the mining claim or goes close enough that curious folks can see it. Again, it's an opportunity to relocate. So it's that type of issue to look at.
Yeah, great info, Tom. And just to back up on grazers, I think you'll know where I'm coming from when I ask, what's the number one way to lose access or at least get grazers mad at you as an OHV user?
If you're riding through the thing, if there's gates that are closed, when you get there, make sure they're closed when you leave, because they spend a lot of time putting in range fences and those kinds of things to keep cattle where they belong. And if you don't take care of that, or if you're coming into an area and you see cattle that are concentrated, slow down, give them time to move as you're going through there, and then you go on your way and they can go on theirs. But it's that conflict, because those cattle are up there to gain weight. And if they get run around or if they get moved around a lot, they don't gain as much weight. And the other thing is, if you leave the gate open and all the cattle start heading back to the barn before they're supposed to, or heading into a new pasture before they're supposed to, why, you're starting to add expense and time to the rancher and his crew to get them moved back where they belong. So it's just a matter of riding responsibly and recognizing that there's other people on that land that have reasons to use it.
Excellent. We have a question from JC Sanders, and a little plug. I spoke with JC today, and we're going to feature him in a story on the Novak website here in the next couple weeks. So keep an eye on that. But his question is, how often do you or should you visit with your land manager?
That sort of depends on one. Obviously you need to be started out with them, and if you haven't heard from them, you might just touch base with them and see if there's anything they need. If you've left them something on your initial visits, you have the ability to call them up and ask them if they have their question, if you have any questions. Now, this is a personal promotion. I wrote the original management guidelines for OHV recreation that Novak published, and which has now been replaced by the Great Trails book, which is much more comprehensive. But mine was at a level that's relatively simple to read, and it's something that's available online, and it's something you can leave with a manager that maybe has expressed some interest in understanding OHV use and wants to learn something, and you can follow up with them and see if there's something else they need or if they had any questions. When I took mine down when I was here, I took it down to my hydrologist, and I'd been working with him for a while, and we'd had some disagreements and some agreements. And I gave him the book, and he was appropriately impressed, I guess. But I saw him about 3 weeks later at another meeting, and he came up to me and he says, "Hey, I read that book of yours." He says, "Those are some of the same issues you were telling me about, weren't you?" And I said, "Yeah, that was already in the book." But that kind of thing is something easy. It's relatively easy to let them pursue and peruse and go through, and it gives them some information. But if you haven't heard from them, if you have a question, you've been out, you see something's changing or may change. If you see it changing, it's probably a little bit too late, but you need to be involved with it. But the other thing is, watch their website. They're still, as far as I know, they're still publishing quarterly reports of proposed actions for their NEPA documents and those kinds of things. So if something comes up that you may have an interest in, give them a call. Go in and talk to them.
Great info, Tom. And I suspect the need to meet with your land manager will change. You might be in the middle of an issue and maybe meet with them once a week, or you might need to just maintain a relationship while you're kind of in between issues and maybe every couple months or something.
Yeah, right.
But I will say there still is a need for the management guidelines for off-highway vehicles, which was written by Tom Crimmins in conjunction with the Great Trails Guide. Both can be gotten from our website. If you go to nohvcc.org and go to the online resources hub, you'll find them. Alternatively, you can email trailhead@nohvcc.org, and we'll make sure we get you copies of those. They're outstanding resources. And as Tom indicated, there still is a need for that for his book. It's shorter, it's easier to consume, and it gets broad principles into the front of the people that are maybe less willing to sit down and read 350 pages. Tom, we have another question for you. If you need to move up the line on a district ranger's decision, how and to who do you go to?
Okay, well, the next level up from the district ranger is the forest supervisor in a U.S. Forest Service situation. And that is one of the things I mentioned with a change in the appeals process and a change in the challenge process. There is a process that's documented about if they make a decision and you need to move it up and appeal the decision, then that's one thing. If they're just difficult to work with, there are ways to get things done, and to if it becomes adversarial, of course, one of the first steps, if you go in and meet with them, they say, yeah, we're going to do this, and you need to do that, or whatever the discussion is. At the end of the meeting, for example, a good way to document that meeting is for you to write a letter of your understanding that simply says, hey, I appreciate taking the time to have a meeting. I know we discussed these issues, et cetera, and I understand that you agreed to this and I agreed to this, and document those kinds of decisions. Those kinds of discussions, because it starts locking things down to at least getting common understanding. Because if you send them the letter and that's not what they agreed to, then they need to let you know that, no, you misunderstood what I said, and I'm not going to open the trail in 2 weeks, or whatever else it happens to be. Once you built that paper trail and you get promises or some commitments that don't get met, and there's ways to move it up to the next management level, which would be a supervisor's level, and it becomes somewhat adversarial, but it's a professional decision. The challenge and the old appeals process, that's a formal process, and there's steps, and everybody has response periods and that kind of stuff. But otherwise, why, you can, if you're not getting responses from the ranger, and they're not communicating, or whatever else it is, you can always just put a simple letter together to the forest supervisor saying, attached is a letter that some questions I asked this local district ranger, and it's been 3 months and I haven't heard anything, and I've tried twice to call, or whatever the details, and I just asked the forest supervisor to look into the situation. And generally they will. Most managers just as soon not have their bosses calling them up and saying, hey, I got a letter from OHV Charlie down here, and he's saying you're not talking to him. But it moves it up. And if that doesn't work, later on, a letter to the regional forester with a copy of the letter you sent to the supervisor and a copy of the letter you sent to the district ranger. And forest supervisors don't like the regional foresters to know about it either. And so, it generally tends to stimulate some communication.
So Tom, I have a couple follow-up questions and then we're getting right on an hour. But first, is it important to do formal letters for your documentation or do emails work?
Emails will work fine. They're basically the same. The emails are retained in the system. You don't need, the signed receipt type thing, although you can do that on many emails. But to recognize that they got it, all that shows is that somebody read it.
And then I guess it's important to exhaust every opportunity you have with the individual, the ranger in this case, before moving up, right? You wouldn't want to do this after you kind of didn't get your way one time or something like that.
No, it's after if somebody just becomes habitually non-communicative, then those may be the chances to move them up. But no, if the ranger makes a decision and it's not what you wanted, why, it's always worthwhile sitting down and saying, hey, why did you do it this way rather than that way? And they may have some valid reasons. And those kinds of things, maybe you don't agree with their reasons, but again, it's a balanced situation. Those kinds of things, you don't necessarily move them up. But once somebody becomes a long-term problem, then there's time to move it up.
And I guess finally on this topic, what's your thought on, should you let, in this case, the district ranger know that you're going to move it up, or do you think it makes more sense to do it without letting them know?
I would send them a copy of the letter, or you could call them up and saying, hey, I thought we agreed that you were going to try to do this in 3 months, and here it's been 6 months and still nothing's happened. And I've tried to talk to you before, so I'm going to, the attached letter, I'm going to send it to the forest supervisor or something of that nature. That's, it's, again, you're letting them know what's coming. Nobody likes to be blindsided. And it could very well be that you're getting letters signed by the district ranger that are written by a recreation staff officer. And, so don't always blame the district ranger, because they're the ones that have the signing authority. And so, maybe it's, if you talk about the issue, it could be very well that they would start applying pressure to their land manager, their trail manager, to get out and start getting busy doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Thank you. We've got time for one last question and then a quick wrap up. So Tom, from Peter, the question is, with regard to private land segments, what incentives have you used to get permission to cross private land?
I haven't been involved in a lot of private land issues, but again, if a private landowner has an issue,
Tom, I think
yeah.
he's talking, I believe he's talking about private land segments within Forest Service.
Within Forest Service.
Yeah.
In a lot of places, you'll have a landowner with a relatively small parcel. Even though if you've had a trail that crossed that small parcel for a long time, and now all of a sudden they've decided to build themselves a house, the best way to deal with that is to look at a way, because is there any way to get around it? And building a trail right down the property line is probably legal, but it may not be the best way to develop a relationship with the private landowner and the land manager, because there's a case in California that went massive because of that exact same reason. The original trail crossed the private land. The private landowner wanted it out of their land, off their land. So the district ranger, who was very supportive of OHV use, went to the private land boundary on one spot, built a trail right down the fence, and connected to the other side of the loop. And he was done. He was happy. Well, she wasn't, and it ended up in the court system, and it ended up costing the forest thousands of dollars. And there was a better way to get around that. So that kind of thing is one that's a harder one to deal with. If it's a fairly large land parcel, and there's a way, and getting across it is critical to connecting the trails, then maybe there's a portion of the ground that they're willing to look at and allow some use on. Maybe you need to move the trail from one side of a ridge over to another side of the ridge on the same landowner's parcel. A big part of it is spending some time with that landowner and trying to find out why they want it closed. I mean, there are some landowners that have, and they're running into a lot now, is people are coming and buying a parcel of ground that currently has a road or an access way across it, and then they want to close that access way because there may be no easements, and they want to close it primarily to protect their own private hunting land on government land behind their parcel. So it's a long. There may be a lot of reasons that they're trying to do that, some of which may be very valid and some of which aren't. And so, it may be necessary to go to a county or a local jurisdiction and see if that long-term use of that road has developed any jurisdictional issues to where a county could go forward and get something. Or, there's a number of other ways to look at different ways to do that if that's your issue. So the first thing is developing some sort of communication with the landowner as to what problems he wants to solve by getting you off the ground. And if it's, you may be able to solve it and still cross that piece of ground to make the connections you need to make.
Thanks, Tom. So it sounds a lot like dealing with land managers. If you better understand what they're trying to do or what they need or what they want accomplished, you can come up with unique solutions to the issue and perhaps even maintain the access you're looking for if you're willing to be flexible. But I imagine, like with the rare few land managers who simply won't budge, there may be some private landowners who won't as well. So that may call for different measures.
Right.
With that, I really want to take the opportunity to thank Tom. As I indicated at the beginning of this, he's a friend and one of my personal favorites to deal with in my entire career. I could listen to him for a long time, but we want to be respectful of his time and yours. As you've seen for quite a while now, his contact information is up on the screen. He's certainly willing to be asked questions. You can reach all of us. Laura put it in the chat box how to reach all of the Novak staff, which is trailhead@nohbcc.org. We'd be happy to help in any way. And heads up to Dan. I'm going to ask him in just a second if Dan, the president and chairman of the board of Novak, if he has any closing remarks. But I, for one, am thrilled with this presentation and with what Tom has said and done. And I think we'd love to hear more from him. He has a wealth of knowledge, and we may have him later in the year do another webinar on a different topic. So if you enjoyed this as much as I did, you'll definitely want to come back and hear what his new topic is and how he can apply his experience there. With that, I would quickly turn it over to Dan and see if you had anything you wanted to add.
Thanks, Wayne. Yeah, I'd also like to thank Tom and sitting through this whole thing. Thinking back over 20 years ago, Tom got involved with Novak, was one of the first guys that started advising Novak and stuff. And over the years, we knew working with the land manager was a make or break on a lot of our writing opportunities. And Tom's been there helping us, guide us through, and also helped facilitate getting the program managers and the Novak conferences together. And it's been a huge success, and I just want to thank Tom again for all the years of helping us out and getting us where we are. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. So again, if you like this webinar, there will be more this year. There will be varied presenters and topics. We know that March is going to be a joint webinar with American Trails about a new group called Trails Move People. You can watch the email and the Novak website. There'll be an announcement about that one in the next few days. We think there's some really good information about working together with disparate uses. One of the things I'm excited about in my career is since I started, I've seen an almost exclusively adversarial relationship with other user groups turn in towards something where there is a willingness to work together. And Trails Move People is exemplary of that. And so I really like the idea. And if you have interest in that topic, please join in. Again, the notice will be sent out soon. With that, any number of information, tools and information can be found on nohpcc.org. If you're not already visiting and signed up, please do so. And we will talk to you soon. Thank you, everyone. Good night.